Ask everyone.
Women share the biggest mistake single men always make. Story 1, he asked if I was dating anyone. While dating me, I was seeing someone I really liked. We'd been talking for weeks and even gone on a couple of amazing dates. We had deep conversations, laughed until our stomachs hurt, and everything felt like it was building up to something meaningful. Then one afternoon, he casually asked me, "Are you seeing anyone else right now?" I blinked for a moment, confused. I answered, "No, I'm just dating you." But then he said, "Cool, just wanted to know if I was competing with anyone." Competing? That word stuck with me. I wasn't looking for a race. I was hoping for a connection. It made everything feel transactional, like he was trying to size me up against invisible rivals. What bothered me most wasn't the question, it was the mindset behind it. After that, things just started feeling off. He kept dropping little comments that made it seem like we were playing some kind of game. I don't want to be treated like a trophy someone's trying to win. I want to be seen, understood, and valued for who I am, not how I measure up against other women. Reflection: when dating feels like a competition, everyone loses. Real intimacy comes from authenticity, not tactics. Story 2, he told me I was just like his ex. One of the worst things a guy ever said to me came out of nowhere. We were having dinner, just a normal weeknight, and he suddenly paused mid-bite and said, "You remind me of my ex." I asked, "How so?" He responded, "Well, you kind of talk like her. And she also liked red wine." At first I brushed it off. People naturally see similarities in others. But then he kept bringing her up. In nearly every conversation, he'd reference some moment they had or compare something I said to her. It got to the point where I felt I was dating a ghost. I understand that past relationships leave imprints. But constantly being compared to someone he used to love made me feel like I was just a replacement, not someone new with my own story to tell. Eventually, I told him it wasn't working for me. I wanted a fresh start, not to live in someone else's shadow. And he just couldn't let go of the past. Reflection: we all have history, but dragging it into a new relationship can strangle the present. Story 3, he asked what I bring to the table. I matched with a guy on a dating app and we started chatting. Things were flowing well until he hit me with a curveball. He asked, "So, what do you bring to the table in a relationship?" I stared at the screen for a while, unsure how to answer. "I'm not applying for a job, I'm trying to make a human connection." Still, I typed out a few things about myself: emotionally intelligent, creative, empathetic, loyal. He replied with, Sounds like standard stuff. I'm looking for someone really exceptional." That sent up a huge red flag for me. The idea that I had to sell myself or audition for his attention made me feel disrespected. Relationships aren't business transactions. They're built on mutual respect and emotional safety, not resumes. We didn't talk much after that. I want someone who sees me as a partner, not a checklist. Reflection: if dating feels like a job interview, you're not building love, you're negotiating ego. Story 4, he said he didn't believe in labels. Things were going great. We texted daily, saw each other every week, and even met each other's friends. So one day, I asked, "What are we?" He hesitated and said, "I don't really believe in labels. I think they complicate things." I tried to stay cool, but inside I felt deflated. We were already doing all the relationship things, why deny the label if it matched our reality? He said he wanted to keep things easy and natural, but it felt like he just didn't want to commit. Eventually, his behavior made it clear that he was keeping his options open. Not believing in labels was just code for wanting freedom without accountability. I walked away, because I know what I deserve: clarity and intention. Reflection: avoiding labels might feel modern, but clarity is kindness. Ambiguity breeds anxiety. Story 5, he thought jealousy was romantic. At first, it seemed like a movie. He'd say things like, "I just hate when guys stare at you," or, "I don't want you going out looking so good." I brushed it off. Maybe he was just really into me, right? But soon, it turned into, "Why are you texting your guy friends?" and, "Who were you with last night?" His tone changed. It wasn't playful anymore. It was control disguised as love. Jealousy might look passionate on screen, but in real life, it's exhausting. I was constantly explaining myself, justifying harmless things. It wore me down. Eventually, I realized it wasn't love, it was fear wrapped up in possessiveness. And that kind of fear can't grow a healthy relationship. Reflection: love doesn't demand control, it thrives on trust and freedom. Story 6, he said I wasn't mysterious enough. We had been chatting for a few weeks. He seemed into me, asking questions, sending late-night texts, even saying he wanted something real. So I thought we were connecting. That is, until he said something that made me tilt my head. "You're cool," he said. "But I wish you were a little more mysterious." I asked him what he meant. He said I gave too much away and that women who keep things to themselves are more exciting. That hit me hard. I wasn't being oversharing, I was just being honest. Vulnerable. Myself. He wanted a puzzle, not a person. What bothered me wasn't the idea of mystery, it was that my openness was treated like a flaw. I want a partner who welcomes real connection, not someone chasing fantasy. If being honest made me boring to him, then he wasn't ready for something real. So I stopped texting back. Life's too short to be somebody else's mystery novel. Reflection: if someone prefers intrigue over honesty, they're chasing excitement, not connection. Story 7, he made me his therapist. I started dating this guy who was super charming at first, funny, smart, emotionally aware. Or so I thought. Quickly, things shifted. Every conversation turned into a venting session about his job, his childhood, his past relationships. He didn't ask about me. It was all him. He'd drop heavy emotional confessions randomly. One time, he called me at midnight crying about how his ex hurt him. I tried to be kind, but I wasn't his therapist, I was just someone he barely knew. It wasn't that he had problems. We all do. It's that he expected emotional labor without offering it back. My boundaries faded quickly, and before I knew it, I was his emotional crutch. I eventually had to tell him, gently, that I couldn't continue. I wanted romance, not a counseling job. He didn't take it well, but I knew I had to protect my energy. Reflection: a relationship isn't a therapy session. Emotional support must flow both ways. Story 8, he didn't know how to listen. We were on our 4th date. I had just shared something deeply personal, how my dad had passed away last year and how it changed me. I opened up, feeling safe. He nodded, but within seconds, he changed the subject completely. "So, what do you think of this sushi place?" he asked. I stared at him. My heart was still racing. I didn't expect him to solve my grief, I just wanted him to acknowledge it. But he skipped over my pain like it was inconvenient. That moment showed me everything. He wasn't mean or rude. But he lacked emotional presence. I need someone who sees me, even in silence. Someone who can sit with sadness without fleeing. When someone doesn't listen, connection breaks. And I knew then, we were done. Reflection: listening is love. Ignoring someone's pain erases the chance for true connection. Story 9, he wanted me to prove my worth. He once said to me, "If you really care, you'll do more to show it." I already felt I was being thoughtful, checking in, sending sweet texts, planning dates. But his words made it sound like I was on trial. He had a list of things I needed to meet emotionally, and if I didn't, it meant I wasn't serious. It turned manipulative. He'd test me, ignore texts to see if I'd double text, bring up fake scenarios just to gauge my reaction. I started questioning myself constantly, am I being loving enough? But love isn't about passing tests. It's about showing up authentically. When I realized he was more invested in measuring me than knowing me, I let go. I want partnership, not performance. Reflection: true love doesn't demand proof, it recognizes value without conditions. Story 10, he said, "You're not like other girls." When he told me I wasn't like other girls, I didn't know how to respond. At first, it sounded like a compliment. But as he explained, I realized he meant that I didn't wear too much makeup, that I didn't act dramatic, and that I had chill vibes. He framed all those things as superior traits. But it didn't sit right. I know plenty of amazing women who wear makeup, express emotions, and own their personality. Reducing them to a stereotype just to elevate me wasn't flattering, it was insulting. Eventually, I called him out. I said, "You're not complimenting me, you're shaming other women." He got defensive, but I stood my ground. We're not special because we're different, we're all unique. And no one should be praised at the expense of others. Reflection: real appreciation doesn't compare. It celebrates individuality, not feeds division. Story 11, he asked me to tone it down. I've never been one to dim my personality. From childhood, I was the vibrant one, laughing loudly, sharing openly, and wearing my heart on my sleeve. That didn't change as I got older. I've always believed that my energy is part of my charm. So when I met him, I assumed he saw that too. He often told me, "I love how you light up the room." We spent weeks getting closer, and I started imagining that maybe this could be something real. One evening, we were heading to meet some of his close friends. I was excited, even picked out a bold outfit that matched my vibe. As I finished getting ready, he looked at me and said, "Hey, do you think you could tone it down a bit tonight?" I paused mid-lipstick swipe. "Tone it down?" I asked. He shrugged. "Yeah, I mean, you're kind of a lot sometimes. My friends are chill, and I don't want them to think you're too much." I stared at him in silence. He'd packaged the comment in a calm tone, as if it were some reasonable request. But it hit me like an insult. What exactly was I supposed to tone down? My personality? My enthusiasm? The fact that I wasn't quiet and reserved like someone he thought his friends would approve of? That night, I tried. I kept my voice lower, resisted jumping into conversations, and tucked away stories that I'd normally share with pride. It was exhausting. I felt like an actor pretending to be someone I wasn't, and every time I caught myself holding back, resentment bubbled up. Later, when he asked if everything was okay, I told him how I felt. He defended himself, saying he didn't mean anything by it, that he just wanted things to go smoothly. But I realized something important: the person who truly values me wouldn't ask me to be less. They'd welcome me fully, energy and all. So I let the relationship fade out. I didn't yell, I didn't fight, I just chose not to shrink myself anymore. That moment reminded me that love should feel expansive, not restrictive. If I'm ever too much for someone, they're probably not enough for me. Reflection: if someone asks you to dim your light, it's a sign you shine brighter than they're prepared for. Never shrink to fit into someone else's shadow. Story 12, he thought being nice was enough. He was one of those guys everyone likes. The kind that makes people say, "He's such a gentleman." And he really was, polite, respectful, the kind of person who'd send good morning texts and hold doors open. So when we started dating, I felt like I'd finally met someone solid. But somewhere along the way, it started to feel empty. We'd talk daily, but our conversations never went anywhere beyond surface-level topics. He asked about my day, but never about my goals. He complimented my smile, but never asked about the things that made me cry. I once tried telling him about a creative passion I was nervous to pursue, and he just nodded and replied, "That's cool." I needed more. One afternoon, I decided to be honest. I said, I feel like you don't see me. Like you're here, but not really. He smiled and replied, I'm always nice to you. Isn't that enough? That was the moment it clicked. He thought being nice was the goal. But kindness is just the first step. I don't need a partner who's only polite, I need one who's present. The final straw came when I opened up about a deep family issue. He listened, then changed the subject to his favorite pizza toppings. Not because he was cold, he just wasn't capable of emotional depth. And maybe that's fine for some people, but not for me. So I ended it. No drama. Just the realization that niceness without connection is like a beautifully wrapped box with nothing inside. Reflection: politeness is comforting, but emotional presence is transformative. Don't mistake quiet kindness for deep care. Story 13, he was always too busy. When we first met, his ambition impressed me. He told me he worked in finance, managed tight deadlines, and had huge career goals. I admired that. We texted each morning, planned weekly dinners, and had real conversations. He told me, I'll always make time for what matters. At the time, that felt reassuring. But soon, things changed. The texts stopped coming consistently. Plans started falling through. Sorry, work is insane, he'd say. Or, something came up. At first, I didn't panic. I believed what he said. Everyone has busy stretches. But then the gaps widened. He'd go days without contact, and when I reached out, he replied with two-word answers. There was no anger, no drama, just this slow fade. I brought it up gently, saying, I feel like you're pulling away. He said, it's not you. I'm just overwhelmed. Give me time. So I gave him time. I gave patience. I gave silence when he didn't reply. But what I didn't get in return was effort. He kept me waiting, hoping things would go back to how they were. They didn't. Eventually, I realized I was giving space to someone who wasn't making room for me. He wasn't malicious, just absent. And absence sends a message all on its own. I left quietly. I didn't confront him or beg for attention. I simply chose not to keep trying to occupy space in someone's life that didn't feel welcoming anymore. Reflection: if they wanted to, they would. Attention isn't found in promises, it's proven in presence. Story 14, he tried to fix me. I've never claimed to be perfect. I'm messy with my laundry, forget birthdays sometimes, and get anxious in new situations. But I've always believed that my imperfections are part of my charm. They make me real. So when I started seeing him, I thought I'd found someone who embraced authenticity. In the beginning, he complimented how refreshing I was. He said I was unfiltered in the best way. I believed him. But slowly, things shifted. He began suggesting changes. You should really be more organized, he'd say while glancing at my cluttered apartment. Or, you'd feel less anxious if you ran every morning. He even gently mocked how loud my laugh was in public, saying it drew too much attention. It wasn't cruel, but it chipped away at me. Each suggestion felt like a gentle erasure. It wasn't that he didn't care. He did. But not about me as I was. He cared about what I could become, the improved version he envisioned. I became a project, not a person. One day, after another unsolicited tip on how I could be better, I asked, would you still love me if I stayed exactly the same? He looked away. That was my answer. So I left. I let him keep his blueprint of the ideal woman, and I walked away as the real one. I wasn't perfect, and I never want to be. I want someone who sees my chaos and calls it home, not a fixer-upper. Reflection: you deserve someone who dances in your mess, not someone who's always reaching for a broom. Story 15, he made everything about himself. He was magnetic, the kind of guy who held court in every room. Intelligent, funny, charismatic. He could talk about economics, pop culture, and sports in one breath. Our dates were filled with laughter and energy. But somewhere in all that noise, I realized something subtle but huge: he never asked about me. I'd listen to him talk about his ambitions, his travels, his childhood stories. I knew his favorite meal, his dream vacation, even the ringtone on his phone. But he never asked mine. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just enthusiastic. But the imbalance kept growing. I once started telling him about a difficult moment in my life, something deeply personal. He nodded, then said, "That reminds me of when I had to drop out of grad school temporarily," and shifted completely into his own story. It happened over and over. Every time I opened up, he redirected the spotlight. One night, I gently said, "Sometimes it feels like I'm your audience, not your partner." He laughed nervously and said, "You just have to jump in. I'm used to being the talker." But love isn't about competing for airtime. It's about invitation. About carving out space for each other. I realized that while he was brilliant, he wasn't curious. He didn't want to know me, only to be known. So I stopped performing, and I walked away. Reflection: being seen starts with being asked. A relationship isn't a solo, it's a duet. Story 16, he got defensive when I was honest. From the beginning, I told myself, communication would be key. I'd been in relationships where I felt silenced, and I wasn't going to let that happen again. So when I started dating him, I promised to speak my truth gently and clearly. One evening, I noticed he'd been distant, long delays in texts, vague responses. So I said, "Hey, I just want to share that I feel a little anxious when you take hours to reply. I know you're busy, but I wanted to be honest." I expected reassurance. Instead, he snapped. "So now I can't even be busy without you getting upset?" he asked, visibly irritated. I paused. I wasn't accusing, I was inviting a conversation. But he was already defensive. That reaction became a pattern. Anytime I shared a feeling, whether about plans, tone, or something that hurt, he'd spin it into a personal attack. I stopped feeling safe to speak up. I stopped sharing. And that's when I knew, emotional safety wasn't there. Being honest shouldn't feel like walking into a minefield. It should feel like walking into someone's arms. I eventually ended things. Not because of one fight, but because being honest felt risky. And that's not love. Reflection: if honesty triggers blame, the relationship lacks trust. Openness should build bridges, not walls. Story 17, he used humor to avoid depth. When I met him, I thought I'd struck gold. He was hilarious, the kind of guy who had punchlines for everything and could diffuse any awkward moment with a perfectly timed joke. He made me laugh, deep, stomach-clenching laughter that left me breathless. That was what drew me in initially. Humor is magnetic. For a while, it felt refreshing. Our dates were filled with banter and inside jokes. Even serious topics were breezed through with sarcasm or witty one-liners. And honestly, after previous relationships filled with heavy emotional weight, this felt like a breath of fresh air. But I started to notice a pattern. When I tried to open up, when I wanted to share the real, messy parts of myself, he'd dodge. I once told him I'd had a rough week dealing with anxiety. He responded with, "Ah yes, anxiety, the spice of adulthood," and laughed. I laughed too, at first. But inside, I was sinking. Another time, I shared a story about my dad's passing. It was quiet, raw, and vulnerable. He nodded and then said something about how he couldn't imagine losing someone who bought him ice cream as a kid. It was offbeat, mildly humorous, and then he quickly changed the subject. It wasn't that he was cruel or indifferent. It was that he couldn't sit with discomfort. He didn't know how to hold space for someone's pain without needing to distract or deflect. And as time went on, I began to feel invisible behind the punchlines. Humor is beautiful, one of the best ways to connect. But when it becomes armor, it blocks the very intimacy it's meant to support. So I told him, I need more than laughs. I need real connection. His silence said everything. Reflection: when jokes become shields, vulnerability gets shut out. Laughter should lift us, not hide us. Story 18, he wanted me to be grateful for bare minimum. He was decent. Courteous. Reliable in the basic ways, he'd show up on time, respond to texts, and remember my birthday. Compared to past experiences, it felt like relief. He once joked, "Hey, at least I'm not toxic like your ex," and I laughed. But I didn't know that line would start to feel real. Over time, I realized he treated his bare minimum like gold. If I asked for deeper communication or more consistent support, he'd reply, "Wow, you know most girls would be lucky to have a guy who doesn't cheat." It felt like I was supposed to celebrate the absence of bad behavior, rather than the presence of good. He didn't engage in thoughtful conversations. He rarely asked about my goals or feelings unless I brought them up first. Any emotional need I expressed felt like a burden. When I said I wanted more affection, more vulnerability, he'd call me needy or spoiled. That was his pattern, doing just enough to stay likable, but never enough to feel truly committed. I began second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too demanding. But asking for love shouldn't feel like asking for a luxury. It should feel natural, reciprocated. Eventually, I realized he thought being not terrible was the same as being good. But a lack of cruelty isn't the same as kindness. Absence of harm is not love. So I walked away, not because he was awful, but because I deserved extraordinary. Not just tolerable. Reflection: doing the minimum isn't a medal, real love shows up with effort, not excuses. Story 19, he thought passion was enough. We burned fast. From the start, it was electric: constant texting, surprise visits, stolen kisses in unexpected places. He'd sweep me up in late-night drives with no destination, play me songs that reminded him of me, say things like, "I've never felt this fire before." And I felt it too. That intoxicating rush of someone who made every moment feel cinematic. But fire can't be the whole foundation. As time passed, I saw the cracks. He wasn't there when I needed calm. During hard days, he'd disappear for hours. When I talked about future plans, he'd say, "Let's live in the moment." Every time we hit a snag, he'd pull away and return only when the vibe was right. One evening, I sat on his couch, silently grieving a personal loss. He changed the song to something upbeat and said, "Let's not kill the mood." I realized in that moment, he loved the highs, not the whole journey. Passion is amazing. It ignites. But it doesn't sustain. You need commitment, patience, and presence. And those things don't come in fireworks, they come in quiet gestures that require effort. I told him I needed more than sparks, I needed stability. He couldn't offer that. So I let go of the fire. Reflection: passion begins the story, but consistency finishes it. Love is the warmth that stays. Story 20, he gave me just enough to stay. He wasn't awful. That's what made it so complicated. He texted just often enough that I wouldn't forget about him. He planned dates occasionally, usually after I brought it up. He complimented me when I least expected it. Every time I considered leaving, he'd do something sweet, just enough to keep me hoping. It felt like emotional breadcrumbing. He was charming when he wanted to be, distant when he didn't. I'd express my need for clarity, and he'd say, "I'm just not good with words, but you mean a lot." I stayed. Hoping things would evolve. Hoping he'd try harder. But the rhythm never changed. When I pulled away, he'd reel me back in. When I leaned in, he'd disappear again. It was exhausting. One night, I asked him directly, "What are we?" He smiled and said, "Something beautiful." Can't that be enough? It wasn't. Because hope isn't nourishment. I was hungry for connection, and he kept offering crumbs. I wanted love that felt full, not a taste that kept me starving. So I ended it. I stopped waiting for the next small gesture and chose the whole meal somewhere else. Reflection: when someone offers crumbs, they're telling you how little they plan to feed you. Don't wait for fullness from someone rationing affection. Story 21, he wanted credit for being polite. When I started dating this guy, he was quick to show his good guy behavior. He opened doors, offered me his jacket when it got cold, and never raised his voice. All the basic things we're taught to appreciate in a partner. I did appreciate them, but something felt off. After a few weeks, I began noticing that every time I asked for something more, deeper conversations, vulnerability, or honest engagement, he seemed shocked. He'd say things like, "Most guys would never even do half of what I do for you," or, "You should be grateful I'm respectful." It was confusing. Wasn't basic respect supposed to be basic? He treated it like a rare commodity he was generously offering. Meanwhile, when I asked him to open up emotionally or be consistent in communication, he'd act like I was demanding too much. One day, I told him that while kindness is essential, it's not the whole relationship. I wanted someone who connected with me on a soul level, not just someone who ticked boxes. He shrugged and said, "I guess you're just high maintenance." That cut deep. In reality, I wasn't asking for luxury, just honesty, effort, and depth. But to him, anything beyond surface-level courtesy was a burden. He thought politeness was love. But love isn't passive, it's active. Eventually, I walked away. Because being treated decently is the minimum, not the reward. Reflection: respect should be standard, not exceptional. Love lives in effort, not entitlement. Story 22, he made me compete with other women. We were in the early stages, going on dates, texting every day, getting to know each other. At first, he seemed genuinely into me. But soon, a pattern emerged: he constantly talked about other women. It wasn't always obvious. He'd say things like, "My coworker said something hilarious today, she's honestly brilliant," or, "I used to date someone who was incredible at photography, you'd love her work." It seemed casual, but it added up. Eventually, I started feeling like I was auditioning for a role, competing with women I didn't even know. When I brought it up, he said, "I just have lots of interesting women around me. Doesn't mean I like them more." But that wasn't the point. The issue wasn't attraction, it was that I felt invisible in his world, constantly compared, never centered. One time, he jokingly said, "You're prettier than my ex, but she was a better cook." I smiled politely but died a little inside. I'm not a product on a shelf next to others. I'm not here to outperform strangers to earn affection. Eventually, I told him I wanted out. I needed to be seen, not sized up. Reflection: you don't win love by outperforming others. You're not in a contest, and real love doesn't keep score. Story 23, he said vulnerability was unattractive. We were weeks into dating, and things felt promising. We had chemistry and long conversations, and I began to feel comfortable opening up. One night, I told him about my history with anxiety, how I sometimes struggle in crowded rooms or spiral if I don't feel grounded. I expected compassion. Instead, he paused and said, "You should probably work on that. It's not very attractive." I froze. He didn't yell. He didn't insult me. But that one sentence made me feel broken, like my honesty had been a mistake. Vulnerability wasn't welcomed, it was judged. From then on, I pulled back emotionally. I only shared surface thoughts. I stopped talking about the things that scared me or moved me deeply. And in return, the connection faded. One day, I realized I was playing a role, the chill girl, who didn't have flaws. But that wasn't me. I asked myself, do I want someone who only loves the curated version of me? The answer was no. I want someone who sees my cracks and doesn't flinch. Reflection: vulnerability is strength, not weakness. If honesty turns someone away, they were never truly there. Story 24, he treated my silence as agreement. We had conversations where I'd listen more than speak, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was processing. I'm the type who thinks before I responds. But with him, silence became ammunition. He assumed that my quiet meant approval. He'd say things like, "You're not like those argumentative girls, I love how you just go with the flow." At first, I brushed it off. But then I realized, he didn't want a partner, he wanted a mirror. I'd sit through dinner listening to his views on politics, relationships, even what real women should act like. I disagreed with most of it. But any time I started to offer a different perspective, he'd say, "Oh come on, don't ruin the vibe." I wasn't ruining the vibe. I was trying to be honest. Eventually, I told him, "You confuse my silence with support." But I just didn't want to argue. He laughed, like I was joking. That's when I knew, he wasn't listening, just projecting. I left quietly, the final silence being my loudest statement. Reflection: silence doesn't mean agreement. If you never make space for dialogue, you'll never know someone's truth. Story 25, he said empathy made me weak. Empathy is my superpower. I feel things deeply, joy, pain, and everything in between. I've always been the person who notices when someone's upset, the one who checks in, the one who remembers small details. But when I dated him, my compassion was treated like a liability. He said things like, "You care too much," or "You're too emotional to make rational decisions." Once, after I cried during a movie, he laughed and said, "You need thicker skin." I wasn't asking him to cry with me. I just wanted him to understand that feeling deeply isn't a flaw. He saw emotion as chaos, not connection. One day, after a hard phone call with my mom, I was visibly shaken. I told him I needed comfort. He replied, "You're always reacting to stuff, don't let people get to you." That was the moment I realized, he wasn't equipped to walk alongside emotion. He wanted to bypass it. Empathy isn't weakness, it's what lets us connect. If someone treats it like fragility, they'll never know real intimacy. Reflection: caring isn't chaos. Feeling deeply isn't dramatic. If someone avoids emotion, they avoid connection. Story 26, he played the victim too often. In the beginning, I admired how open he was about his past. He talked about previous heartbreaks, difficult family dynamics, even workplace betrayals. He seemed vulnerable and self-aware, qualities I value in a partner. But over time, I noticed something unsettling. In every story, he was the victim. He wasn't just occasionally hurt, he was always the one wronged. His exes were crazy, his parents ungrateful, his coworkers jealous. There were no shades of gray, just him being misunderstood and mistreated. At first, I empathized. I offered reassurance, comfort, and support. But gradually, his narrative started to wear thin. Any disagreement we had became another example of someone turning on him. If I asked for space after an argument, he'd say, "I guess you're just like the rest." I realized he didn't just seek empathy, he weaponized it. He used past pain as a shield against accountability. If he forgot plans, it was because he was emotionally overwhelmed. If he snapped during a conversation, he'd say, "This reminds me of how I was treated before." The final straw came when I calmly expressed frustration about something small, how he never texted back promptly. He sighed dramatically and said, "It's hard being with someone who doesn't appreciate how much I've been through." That's when I knew, this wasn't vulnerability anymore. It was manipulation wrapped in self-pity. I need someone who can own their flaws, not bury them under blame. Reflection: victimhood isn't vulnerability when it deflects growth. Healing starts with accountability, not excuses. Story 27, he said emotional women are exhausting. I'm expressive, I cry when something touches me, I laugh loudly when I'm thrilled, and I get quiet when I'm processing hard emotions. I used to see this as a strength. But when I dated him, that confidence started to erode. He was calm and cool in every situation, almost too cool. When I cried during a tough week, he said, "You're being dramatic." I tried explaining that I wasn't asking him to fix anything, just to be present. He replied, "You need to learn how to control yourself." Every emotional reaction I had became too much. If I got excited about something, he'd call me extra. If I vented, he'd say, "Can't you just let things go?" It felt like I was living in a cage built from his expectations. Slowly, I stopped expressing myself freely. I muted my excitement, held in tears, forced myself to seem calm even when I was aching inside. Then one day, I broke. I couldn't pretend anymore. I asked him directly, "Do you even like who I am, or just the quieter version I've become?" He stared, speechless. I packed up my feelings, all of them, and left. Because my emotions aren't flaws. They're human. Reflection: sensitivity is not instability. Emotional expression is how we connect, not how we break. Story 28, he never apologized, just rationalized. We all make mistakes in relationships. What matters is owning them. But with him, mistakes weren't admitted, they were explained away. One evening, he forgot our anniversary dinner. I had prepared everything, bought a new dress, and waited for hours. When he finally showed up, he didn't apologize. He said, "Things got hectic at work. I figured you'd understand." I did understand. But I also needed acknowledgement. This happened again and again. If he interrupted me mid-sentence, he'd say, "You weren't making your point clearly." If he made a comment that hurt me, he'd reply, "You're just sensitive." I began realizing that he didn't believe he could be wrong. Every hurt became a misunderstanding, every slight became my overreaction. Eventually, I asked him, "Do you believe you're capable of hurting me?" He replied, "I don't think I've done anything that bad." That was it. Apologies aren't weakness, they're strength. I needed someone who didn't just justify their behavior, but who could say, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." So I left. Because I don't want a debate, I want accountability. Reflection: rationalization protects ego. Apology nurtures connection. The difference builds, or breaks, trust. Story 29, he saw independence as rejection. I'm independent. I have my own goals, passions, and life rhythm. When I'm in a relationship, I love sharing, but I also treasure solitude. When I met him, he admired that, at least, he said he did. But after a few weeks, I noticed the shift. If I wanted a day to myself, he'd say, "Why do you always need space?" When I traveled for work, he'd grow distant, later confessing he felt abandoned. If I went out with friends without inviting him, he'd sulk. It started small, subtle comments, questions, jokes. But then it turned heavy. I'd get texts like, "I guess you prefer your friends over me," or, "I just don't feel wanted." No matter how much reassurance I gave, he interpreted my independence as rejection. I told him, "I can love you and still need time for myself." He replied, "If you really loved me, you wouldn't need space." That line gutted me. Needing solitude doesn't mean I'm pulling away, it means I'm preserving the balance that allows me to show up fully. Eventually, I realized I was shrinking my world to accommodate his insecurities. That's not love. Reflection: independence isn't distance, it's strength. In healthy love, space isn't threatening, it's respected. Story 30, he liked the idea of me, not me. He was enthusiastic from the start. Said I was exactly the kind of woman he'd imagined being with. Smart, adventurous, driven. I felt seen, or so I thought. But as we spent more time together, things got blurry. He made comments like, "I always wanted someone who'd fit well with my work lifestyle," or, "You're the type who'd make an amazing mom someday." It wasn't that I minded those things, but they felt scripted. When I expressed parts of myself that didn't match his image, like my creative chaos, my need for flexibility, my spiritual interests, he looked confused. He said, "You're not exactly what I expected." One day, I told him I was considering a break from my career to travel and refocus. He said, "That's not very stable. I thought you were more ambitious." That's when I knew, he didn't love me. He loved the role I played in his dream. So I stepped out of his fantasy and back into myself. Reflection: you can't build real love from an idealized version. True connection begins where expectation ends. Story 31, he didn't understand emotional timing. I've always been aware of emotional timing, when to speak, when to listen, when to simply sit with someone in silence. But with him, timing didn't matter. Every moment had to be convenient for him. I remember one particular night when I was grieving hard. A friend had gone through a sudden loss, and it hit me deeper than I expected. I was shaken, reflective, quiet. I texted him that I'd had an emotional day and would appreciate just talking, no solutions, no lectures, just presence. He replied, "Bad timing, babe. I just started gaming with the boys." I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't that he was busy, that happens. It was that he dismissed my vulnerability like an unwanted notification. It wasn't important enough to pause. This wasn't an isolated moment. If I expressed sadness, stress, or deep feelings, his response was often something like, "Can we not do this right now?" or "You're kinda killing the mood." But relationships are made in real life, not perfect moments. Eventually, I told him, "I need someone who shows up even when it's inconvenient." His response: "You're too emotional sometimes." That was the final blow. I don't need someone at their best. I need someone who's still there at their busiest, their most distracted, someone who doesn't treat my feelings as interruptions. Reflection: emotional support isn't scheduled. Love responds, even when timing's off. Story 32, he treated romance like a checklist. When we started dating, he was strategic. He planned outings, complimented me frequently, and even learned my favorite coffee order. It was sweet, and I appreciated it. But over time, I noticed a strange undercurrent. Romance became routine, like he was following a guide instead of connecting. He'd say things like, "I read that girls love being surprised," before showing up with flowers. Or, "They say you have to say, 'I love you,' within 3 months, just after hitting month 3. It was textbook. I asked him once, "Do you do these things because they feel right, or because they're expected?" He paused, then said, "It's what you're supposed to do." I didn't want scripted gestures. I wanted authenticity. One night, after a serious conversation about my personal struggles, he handed me a teddy bear with a generic card, no mention of what I'd shared, no emotional follow-up. Just a gesture. That's when I realized, he was fulfilling a role, not engaging with a person. I want someone who sees romance not as a requirement, but as a reflection, spontaneous, honest, responsive. Not a checklist. Reflection: romance isn't a formula. Genuine connection makes even small gestures meaningful. Story 33, he thought boundaries were rejection. Boundaries are one of the hardest things for me, not because I don't believe in them, but because I've often been taught that saying no makes you unlovable. So when I started setting boundaries with him, simple things, like needing space to recharge or sticking to weekend plans, I braced myself. And just like I feared, he took them as rejection. If I declined a spontaneous meetup due to prior commitments, he'd say, "Wow, I guess I'm not a priority." If I didn't answer a message immediately, he'd follow up with, "Forget it, I see where I stand." Each healthy choice I made became a signal of distance, when in reality, it was me choosing myself so I could show up better. The weight of managing his reaction became heavier than the boundaries themselves. It felt like I had to constantly explain and defend simple decisions. Eventually, I sat him down and said, "Me needing space doesn't mean I don't care. It means I care enough to be whole." He said, "I just don't think you're emotionally available." That told me everything. Boundaries protect connection, they don't weaken it. But not everyone understands that. Some see them as walls, not doors. Reflection: boundaries aren't distance. They're clarity. Love needs space to breathe, not suffocate. Story 34, he wanted a therapist, not a partner. In the early stages, I thought he was emotionally intelligent. He spoke openly about his struggles, admitted past mistakes, and cried during a heartfelt story he once shared. I admired that, finally, someone emotionally honest. But as we got closer, the balance began to shift. He'd unload everything on me: trauma, anxiety, rage, fears. Every phone call became an emotional avalanche. I tried to support him, listen, validate. But I noticed something missing: he never asked about me. Once, after a long night of his venting, I mentioned that I'd had a rough day too. He replied, "I can't deal with more right now." It wasn't just the imbalance. It was that my emotional world didn't fit into his narrative. He needed space to spill, but not to receive. I became his emotional